Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Your Spiritual Journey. This is Dr. Bob, and this is the space and the place where we talk about things important to your soul. As always, we ask you to like us, maybe leave some comments, and subscribe. All that helps keep us on the air. Today's guest is someone I met at the fundraiser for Chichi Rivera. I've interviewed a couple people from that event, and they've all been wonderful guests. And I'm sure that Emily Rodavich is no exception. She's a retired teacher, author, inventor, and the founder of the Mystical Interludes Discussion Group. While in elementary school, she was traumatized by the death of a neighbor. That event left her with a paralyzing fear of death until age 18, when a near-death experience changed her life. Unfortunately, in those days, a person could lose all credibility by talking about any personal mystical event. So she was advised to never talk about it. But her mystical experiences didn't end there. Everything from synchronicities to an out-of-body visit to a past life have surprised her up to this day. She suppressed her NDE and all those experiences until about 20 years after her retirement, when she began talking and writing about them. This led to many spiritual discoveries and her conviction that we are more than we think we are. Her books are her memoir, Mystical Interludes, An Ordinary Person's Extraordinary Experiences, and Mystical Interludes 2, a collection of ordinary people's mystical experiences. So, Emily, I was fascinated by your story when I first met you. I've been reading your book chapter by chapter over breakfast every morning for a while, so I feel like I've been living with you on a daily basis for about a month now. So I'm going to turn the mic over to you to tell us about your spiritual journey, and then I'll ask you some questions. So the mic's all yours, Emily.
Okay, and what story would you like me to tell?
Well,
I
basically,
have many stories.
basically a capsulized version of your spiritual journey from childhood till now. And I know
Wow.
that's what your book is all about. So maybe just hit the
How
highlights.
many do we have?
Hit the highlights for us. We know that this all started when you observed a neighbor who was at home lying in a coffin. So maybe you could start there.
Yes, yes. Well, yes, that's when my fear of death started at that time. I was very, very close to this neighbor. She was like a grandmother. She would braid my hair and put pretty ribbons in them and read to me, and I loved her dearly. And she passed, but no, I didn't know she had passed. And I was walking past her house and I saw a beautiful wreath on her door. And I hadn't seen her for a while because it was winter time and I was, after school, you went home and you did your homework and so on. And this must have been a weekend. And I went in and when her daughter was very loving, she said, "Oh, mother just loved you. Thank you for coming." And she walked me up to the casket. And that was my first experience with death. And I was, I froze. And that did it. That just did it to me. And I looked at that casket and I couldn't believe that she was not breathing. and I knew that the lid was going to come down. And at that age, it terrified me. So that was how I became traumatized. But, and that's odd because I think I had an unusual spiritual upbringing. I was not, my parents were were of opposing religions. My father was Russian Orthodox. My mother was Roman Catholic, and of course, you know, you know how religions divide us very much like politics do.
Right.
Well, there was a clash. So my parents had been married by a justice of the peace, and so we didn't belong to a church. In fact, there were in the town where I lived, there was neither of those religions had churches. It was a rather a Protestant community. So my mother would pray every evening at dinner. So she modeled prayer for me. And I started asking questions. And that's how I became indoctrinated. But the clincher came. Of course, I have to tell you this. The poor woman, it's a wonder that she lived past my age of about 7, because up to that point, I followed her and asked her questions all the time. Well, about God. Well, why can't I see God? And how do I know that God exists? And you say he exists everywhere. Well, how can that be? Well, she was pretty good. She told me that air exists everywhere. You can't see it, but you couldn't live without it. And love, you can't see it, but it's real. And so that got me thinking. And then, well, what does God do? And she took me outside with some seeds, and little flower seeds, we planted them. And I watched them constantly. And I watched those little green shoots come up through the soil. And when they finally bloomed into flowers, I looked at everything differently. I had seen flowers and trees and grass, but all of a sudden, I knew that there was something there that I couldn't see that performed this magic. And so I began to pray. And it's a good thing, because the next thing that happened was that my parents were separated, and my 2 younger brothers and I were sent to live with an abusive aunt. And my life changed drastically. And uh, the miracle of that is the fact that after my mother returned, I cried myself to sleep every night praying that she would return. And she did. And when she did, I went to sleep. I started to go to sleep one night, and my heart was just filled with joy and gratitude. And all of a sudden it occurred to me my prayer had been answered. And it truly had been answered, because my parents came back together, and they had a pact that they would never go back there and discuss and hold grudges, that they would forgive each other. And they lived together until they both passed, and gave us a wonderful, wonderful childhood and a wonderful life. So that, if that wasn't an answer to a prayer, Bob, I don't know what
Yeah.
was. So that was my spiritual beginning, and I'm pretty happy that that's how I learned about God and how I learned to pray. Now, the second prayer that was answered is pretty remarkable, because what happened is that when my parents got us together, the three of us, they explained that we were going to move to a different place and we were going to be a family again. And I was so thrilled. Guess where we moved? We moved in the in the duplex that my aunt and uncle owned. The apartment next door was empty. And so my father felt beholden. And so we moved there. And my aunt continued to create awful problems for my mother and for me. And it was awful. And I was filled with pain and anxiety. My stomach hurt all the time. I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't even have fun with my friends. And one day I was so miserable. We were out hiking. There were about four of us, and I spotted a tree all by itself in the distance. And I separated from my friends and I went under that tree and I fell to my knees and I opened my heart and I prayed and I said, please, please, dear God, tell me, how can I deal with this hatred within me and anxiety? And how can I get rid of it? Please help me. And I waited and I heard the word forgive just drop right into my mind. And I think it resonated. Forgive. Now, I'm telling you, that was not what I expected.
Yeah.
I I was hoping that we would move away or I hate to say it, but my aunt would die or I mean, all kinds of answers, not forgive. And I thought I knew what the word meant, but I didn't know how to do it. And so I just felt better because I had an answer and it lifted my spirits. But now I had a problem. I had asked for an answer and I had received it, but I didn't know how to do it. So I asked so many people, and it was amazing. Nobody else seemed to know either. And I would ask questions like, well, to forgive, does that mean that you forget? Oh, well, I don't know. Uh, Nobody knew. So finally, I went to a minister that I knew because his wife was our Girl Scout leader. So I went to her and I went to him and we talked about forgiveness. And he told me two things that were quite significant. One was that you have to love, you have to know how to love a person, another human being first. And then you have to find out everything you can about that person to try to discover what was behind what that person did to you. And also, you had to try to take a God's eye view because once somebody does you wrong, when you look at them, all you can see is the negative part of that person. You forget everything else. All right, so he armed me with those things, and I tried and tried, and this took weeks. I would lie in bed at night and I would think, maybe I can love Ann M. Didn't work. Maybe. So finally, I asked my father to tell me everything he could about her. I kept asking questions. And I found out that my dear aunt only made it to the third grade. My grandparents were immigrants and they had many children. My aunt was the firstborn, and she was always helping her mother with housework, with cooking, and taking care of the babies. And the babies just kept coming, and she was burdened with all that responsibility, and she didn't make it past the third grade. And when I heard that, I thought, I was in third grade at the time, and I thought, oh my gosh, what a horrible life. How would I feel if I were in her shoes? And then I realized that she had no children, and there was probably a good reason for that.
Yeah.
And so I picked some flowers and I apologized, and she hugged me so tightly. I found out that she never had a childhood. She didn't have playmates. She didn't go out to play. And so she became my playmate. My best friend and I, after school, we would go to her place and we would play jacks and Chinese checkers. And she taught us to play canasta. And I grew to love her. And I love her to this day. So she's passed, of course. But speaking of mystical interludes, when she passed, um, she woke me up. I was sound asleep. I know this is going to be a little hard for somebody who's never experienced anything like this. I was sound asleep, and I something woke me up, and I opened my eyes, and my Aunt Em was hovering above me, and she was beautiful. She had beautiful blonde hair and the most exquisite blue eyes. And I was so surprised. And she said, "Do you know who I am?" And I said, "Yes, you're Aunt Em." Of course, she didn't look like that in life. I only knew her with all her warts and you know, her overweightness and so on. But I knew who she was. And she said, "This is who I really am." And I said, "I know." And then I fell back to sleep. And then when I woke up um, that morning, as I was getting ready to go to work, I got a phone call that she had passed. So I knew ahead of time.
Yeah.
So that is kind of my early childhood. Um, I always prayed. I always felt the power of our Creator, who has many, many names, many references. Um, but I did have the traumatic experience, and when I turned 18, my life was changed by my near-death experience.
Yeah. You do you recall how that near-death experience came about? 'Cause I know it's in your book, and uh, a lot of your stories, including the one that you just told, brought me to tears as I was reading, because the transparency and the uh, just feeling that you have as you tell these stories really comes through in your book. So, could you let the audience know about your near death experience?
Like, certainly, allergy shots were the newest thing at that time. Um, Everybody had allergies, and all of a sudden there were allergy specialists. And so I had a multitude of allergies, and I went one day and had the shot. I was would take a bus to the doctor's office and so on. And I came home, and even though I waited in the office, I followed the whole protocol. After I got home, my body began to swell and swell and swell. So it was an awful experience because once my body started to swell, it just didn't stop. And my skin was splitting, and my lips were inside out. Um, my heartbeat was booming through my head, and uh, I was suffering from anaphylactic shock. So our family doctor came. We couldn't get a hold of the allergy specialist. He came, and he said to my mother, "All we can do is pray." What was happening was that my swollen tongue was shutting off my air passage. And I can remember going in and out of consciousness. There was a light fixture in the middle of the ceiling, and all of a sudden it would be there, and then it would be gone. And that's
Mhm.
how I knew I was. And then the next thing I knew, I heard the doctor say to my mother, "All we can do is pray." And the next thing I knew, I was in outer space. I was floating in outer space. And I knew it was that because I could see little stars way in the distance. And I felt so free. It was so exhilarating. I could turn, I could flip, I could fly. It was just amazing. And what did I see in the distance but a passenger train? And it was, you know, in my view, it was on an ascent. And immediately I was at the window of the train looking inside. And I saw elderly men and women in dark clothes, dark hats. The men were in dark suits with hats, and the women were in dark dresses, purple, navy, brown, black, and they had long hats with long veils. And I looked to the back, and I was stunned because I saw myself sitting there. And there I was, all pink and alive. And the next thing I knew, I was in my body on the train, excited. Now, you have to understand, these near death experiences are different for every person. If you've ever followed and listened to a variety of them, you always get what you need. And you cannot compare. There are certain things that are um, consistent with near death experiences, but everything else is different. So there I sat looking at these people, and I was so excited because one of the most wonderful experiences of my childhood was a trip on a passenger train with friends. And it was a beautiful day that we spent at uh, Greenwich Village in Detroit, the historical village. So there I was, feeling very, very gleeful, but wondering what this was all about. And I could see the blackness out the windows, and down the aisle comes a very tall conductor. And he had a bush of white radiant hair, a conductor's hat atop his head, and a uniform, and he beamed with joy and light. And he came toward me, and I could just feel his love I radiating, and I felt so safe. And of course, the question girl, the first thing I did was ask him, "Can you please tell me where this train is going?" And he simply said, "We'll be there soon." And I said, "Well, um, what about these people?" And then, are they going, they're all dressed in black and they're not moving. Are they going to a funeral? And he said, and I said, wait a minute, they're not moving. Are they dead? Could they be?" And this fear started. Just, and he said, "Not really." And he said, "Emily," he knew my name, "you stay here. The train is coming to a stop. Um, Wait until the passengers rise and start to depart, and I'll come back for you. And that's exactly what happened. These passengers rose quite rigidly and started down the aisle. And when they got to and it was not a smooth thing, it was kind of rigid. And then I noticed from where I was way back there, I couldn't see beyond the doors, but it looked like each person stopped and waited. I didn't know whether somebody, they were waiting for their name to be called or what. And then they stepped off the train. So the conductor took my hand, and I could just feel love radiating from him. And I felt so safe. And as we followed these people, when I got close enough that I could see beyond the door, um, that's when I saw the light. I still have trouble talking about it. No words. It was more than light. It was music. It was light. It was alive. It was love. It was penetrating. It was everything. It is, can't describe it. And the most amazing thing, as each person stepped off the train into the light, I watched that body meld and merge with the light. And it was astonishing. And then in the distance, I could see little buildings. They had little rounded domes, the way in children's uh, religious books, the way they looked way back when. Um, and I knew all of a sudden I had this total understanding that our bodies don't die, that we are immortal. Our souls, we are really our souls, and they live forever. And I knew that these souls were merging with family and community because I could see the community in the distance. And it was so joyful. It was so wonderful. And I felt like I was a part of it. And of course, I wanted to stay. And the conductor said, Emily, you may see, but you may not get off the train. And of course, I wondered as a teenager, what was I doing on the train in the first place? But the beautiful thing is that when I woke up, the swelling had gone down enough that I could see light through the slits of my swollen eyelids. And my mother was placing cold compresses on my cheeks, and I must have had tears. I must have been crying because she said something about if she could only have my tears, it could be if she could take my tears away. And I thought, oh my gosh, she doesn't realize that I'm crying from joy. I was so filled with ecstasy and love and joy. It was just amazing. So that happened before I had ever heard of anything. Nobody in those days talked about such things. The big deal in those days, Bob, was everyone had to be normal. And if you were talking, about something like that, that was abnormal. And that wasn't right. And there was a kind of a set of social rules that you had to follow. Otherwise, you were an outcast. And so my mother was clairvoyant, but I didn't find that out until I was a teenager. But she kept it very, very close to the vest. And I learned very quickly that I had to keep these things to myself. So I didn't talk about them, but I can tell you this, I never felt normal. I did not feel that I was one of the gang.
Yeah.
Um, I loved everybody. I loved all my friends and my schoolmates and my teachers, but I knew that there was something a little different about me.
Yeah.
And I tried not to show it.
Well, I know that your book is full of these stories, and synchronicities have played a big part in your life, especially around two birds. One being an indigo bunting, uh, and I had to look that one up because my wife does some birding, and I do have a pamphlet uh, that has the indigo bunting on it. And a friend has told me that Frick Park is a good place to find indigo buntings. Would you tell that story, please?
Yes. Um, my mother and I was single. I was married twice and I was single. My mother was in her 80s and she came, had been living in Florida. She came to Pennsylvania to live and we were living together and I was her caregiver. And she passed um, in 2007. And I was I'd missed her terribly, and I suffered grief. Um, I talked to her every day, and I cried because I missed her so much. And then my one of my oldest and dearest friends, who was the godmother to my firstborn, to my daughter Mary, and I have three children, and her name was Joyce, and I got word that she had passed. Well, I was still grieving over my mother. And then when I found out about Joyce, it just sent me even deeper into grief. And even though I know there is no death, I know that they are in a much better place and that they are experiencing amazing love. I know that. But you're here in this body,
Yeah.
and that does not stop you from grieving. There is no antidote for grief. So I was sitting out on our deck, and we had bird feeders out there. And if you can picture this, one of our bird feeders had three columns, three plastic columns, and they had little perches that went through them, three perches.
Mhm.
And we loved the birds. We had several feeders. So I was sitting out there on the deck and I put my head down and the grief was so deep. And I thought, oh my goodness. And I really felt in the back of my mind that I needed my mother.
Mm.
I looked up and on the bottom leftmost perch sat an indigo bird, indigo blue. My mother had white hair, snow white hair, and indigo blue was her signature color. I mean, you put that hair and that color together, and they just complemented each other beautifully. And she wore indigo blue a lot. In fact, she was buried in an indigo blue suit. So when I saw that color, it was, a signal. It was, oh my, I've never seen a bird that color before. And I was so stunned. And I called my Jim at that time, um, and I were together, and he came out, and I said, "Look at this bird." And he said, "Oh," and he went and got the bird book. And I
Yeah.
said, "Jim, what does that say to you?" And he said, "Oh, well, I'll go look it up." And he found it, an indigo bunting, and it was uplifting. And so I left, I drove by myself to North Carolina to go to my friend's memorial service. I went down there, and when I got back a few days later, I came into the house, and one of the first things I said to Jim was, "Did the bunting return?" And he said, "I'm sorry, no, it didn't." And I said, "Oh, I sure could use a visit." And he, of course, Jim was on a different page. And he just said, "Whatever." And so I went out onto the deck and sat back down again. And I sat there and I thought, I looked up, and here sits the bunting, the same place. It never ate anything, it just sat. The first time it didn't eat. This time it just sat. And I said, "Oh my goodness." I was so thrilled. I was so filled with gratitude. I was laughing and crying. And I knew my mother was giving me a sign. And it just filled me. Well, I told the story to my kids. And my youngest daughter, Kara, um, they were all close to my mother. But my youngest daughter, Kara, said to me after another month or so, she said, "Mom, I've been looking everywhere for an indigo bird. I would just love it if Grandma would give me a sign." And she said, "How do you know, Mom? When it's a sign, how do you know it's a sign?" I said, "Kara, um, you know. Um, you will feel something go through you, and there will be no doubt in your mind. It's just immediate, and it's electric." And she said, "Okay," and that was that. Well, meanwhile, up the street from Kara, a fellow who was like a grandfather to her two young daughters, my two granddaughters, passed. And his daughter's name was Veronica. That was my mother's name. And Kara and Veronica had come to know each other very well over the years. So Kara said, "Is there anything I can do to help?" And Veronica lived quite a distance away. And she said, "Oh, it would be so helpful if you would unpack my father's closet and put his clothes in boxes for me so that when I get back, I can dispose of them and so on. That would be a great help." So Carol was there in that house, and I was at that time. Um, Jim and I were having lunch with a friend at the cheese factory, and the phone rang. And I saw that it was my daughter, and I was going to say, "Can I call you back?" And she said, "Mom," she said, "I had a mystical interlude." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "I saw an indigo bunting." And I said, "What happened?" Well, here she was cleaning out this closet for her friend Veronica, and she is hauling these clothes and carrying them and putting them on the bed and folding them into boxes. But she had this very heavy load coming out of the closet. She kind of bounced against the wall because she lost her balance, and she turned and looked on the wall at an indigo bunting, and the words were there, indigo bunting. And because what happened, Bob, at that moment, she had been thinking about, wow, my grandma's name was Veronica, and here I am, and I would just love a sign from grandma, uh and and right there. And when it happened, she knew it. She got the zing, and she was so thrilled. She knew that she had been pushed or something, that she was face to face with this bird. It turns out that the wallpaper had different birds, cardinals and yellow birds and an indigo bunting and different colors of birds with their names. And she just happened to be right in front of the indigo bunting. But that wasn't the end of it. Labor Day came, and my whole family was here. And we have a large deck, and we were gathered out on the deck. And my son, who was traveling a lot at the time, wasn't in on these stories. And so he said, what's this business about that indigo bunting that I heard? And so we told the story. And I had my back to the bird feeders, and my daughter Kara was standing there looking at me, and both of us had been telling the story. And then all of a sudden her jaw dropped, and she went, "Look." Turned around, and there it was. Same place on the feeder, not eating. It was so amazing. The timing was so perfect. I ran into the house, grabbed the camera, and took a picture. And that is the picture on the front of my book. That if you could hold that up, I would appreciate it.
Okay.
So people could.
This is for everybody on YouTube. The book is right here, and there's the picture.
Oh, it's the lighting isn't
Yeah,
good enough.
But it's really something.
Yes. So it appears on the front of my book.
Yeah.
And there are many, many other stories, Bob, but they keep happening. And some of the most amazing, I would like to tell you a more recent one that I've never told before.
Oh,
if you don't mind.
would love to hear that. Yeah.
All this happened during COVID. My husband had brain cancer, and he, after the surgery, and he had radiation to the brain, and he kept getting worse and worse, and he was with hospice. And it was a sad time. And the hospice people were coming to the house. He was in a hospital bed in our bedroom. And I was so careful, worried sick that he might get COVID. And, I was very particular about people coming into the room and that type of thing. Well, what happened was I got COVID. Now, this is pretty amazing because I'm very healthy for my age, and he was the most vulnerable. And we kissed on the lips every day. He did not get COVID. I did. And my first thought was, oh my gosh, we have to get him out of here. So he was taken to a nursing home, and my COVID kept getting worse and worse. And I was to the point where I was hospitalized. And my daughter, I have a daughter who lives in Hawaii, and she came home. And after I came home from the hospital, she was here caring for me. And I just slept all the time. So one night I started to hear that Jim, by the way, not only was he bedfast and couldn't walk, but there were days when he didn't know who I was, and that was the most painful thing I've ever experienced. And then I started to hear from the nursing home that Jim was watching TV and that he was talking to people and he was calling people by name. And I was so surprised. So here I am at home. My daughter, I'm now unable, I'm ambulatory, I'm not sleeping as much. And one night when I absolutely could not sleep, I got my laptop and I went to YouTube. And I don't know if you have ever seen Buddha at the gas pump. It is a podcast where he interviews spiritually enlightening people who are growing spiritually in their experiences. And I like to hear those stories because I identified with them. So I went there and I looked and I didn't care for the speaker that he had. So I wasn't interested. So I went down his list of past speakers and I landed on the name of Dr. Diane Hennessy Powell. Does that name ring a bell at all?
I've heard it, but I don't know her well.
Okay. Here's what happened. I listened to her interview and she spoke for about 2.5 hours, maybe almost 3, about autistic savants. And her work, I didn't, at that time, we didn't know anything about what was going to happen in the future. But she had she had interviewed the parents of autistic kids, and she realized that they were telepathic, that they were communicating, they were reading the minds of their mothers. And she used a lot of her own money to go to these families and take videos and run experiments. And because of her, the telepathy tapes were born. Okay.
Okay, that's
But
where I've heard the name before because I've heard all of the telepathy tapes.
what happened was I watched this interview. She never said a word about dementia, or we thought my husband had dementia. Okay. He was in hospice with dementia. And so I fell asleep. And the next morning I got up and it was all about autism. And I, made myself a cup of coffee and I got this nudge. You know how, I don't know if you get those, you know what I'm talking, I
Oh,
got
yeah.
this nudge. You need to contact her. You need, and I'm thinking, contact, it didn't feel right. And finally I know better. And so I sat down, I got online, I located her, I got her email and I sent her an email. And the email said, um, I watched your podcast. My 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 husband has dementia, but he seems to be improving. Can anybody improve from dementia? And I thought, okay, throwing it to the wind. Well, within an hour, I got a message from her, and she said, your husband does not have dementia. He has a condition that can be reversed. It's called delirium. And then she put me on how to reverse this. And I got in touch with his PCP. Make a long story short, he came out of the nursing home. We had a physical therapist who came, had him on his feet the day after he got home.
Wow.
And, okay. And then every now and then she and I we would email. And then she asked me to send her some of his images, his CT scans and MRIs, which I did. I get an email from her and she says, you need to get a neurosurgeon. And she said he has what is called water on the brain. encephalitis. And she said, you need to get a neurosurgeon. We did. He had water on the brain. He had a shunt installed. He's walking. Today, he grooms himself. He's weak and he is deficient in short-term memory, but he's back. His sense of humor, his personality. He reads novels constantly. We read together in the mornings. We enjoy life together. He's back. Now, and then the good fortune came with the telepathy tapes when Diane's research was behind this global truth, this global reality of knowing that we are so much more than we think we are.
Yeah, that's a marvelous story. Thank you so much for sharing it.
And there's one more having to do with COVID, if you'll grant me.
Okay, I just want to let you know that you wanted to be done at 2:10 and it's 2:05. So
This has to do with COVID as well.
okay.
After he was well and walking and coming along beautifully, he got COVID. Now, he had had the vaccinations, but he was pretty sick. And it was a cold day. And the car was in the garage. We live in a townhouse community. And so I got him, the passenger door was open and he was trying to get into the car. And he's tall. Jim was 6'2". He's shrunk a little, but he's much taller than I am. And he tried to pull himself into the car, but his strength left him and he was kind of half in and half out. And I was trying to hold him up, and I didn't know what I would do if he hit the cold cement floor, because his PCP instructed me to take him to the wellness center where he would get a COVID test. We weren't sure that he had COVID at that time. So there's the frame of the garage door, and I'm looking out, and people usually walk dogs or they're walking or cars. It's a friendly neighborhood, not a soul. And I started to call, help, help. A car pulled up. Excuse me. I could just see the windows, the driver and the passenger. The rest of the car was outside the frame. And I kept yelling and I was waving. And the driver looked up, and a young man, and he opened the door and he said, he heard, and I yelled, help, and he started to run toward me. And I said, I need your help, but he might have COVID. And he backed away quickly. Well, his passenger, his girlfriend, she hopped out of the car. She went like this, got a mask, put it on, and ran up and helped me get him into the car. Now, I didn't know these people. It turned out, excuse me, that she lived right across the street. So once Jim was in the car, I backed my car out and I started up the road. And a man comes out and he's waving his arms. And I stopped, and he came around and he said, do you need a COVID test? I said, yes. It turned out that he was the salesman that sold the tests to the wellness center where we were going. You understand? He said, just pull into my driveway. And he was highly skilled. he came out and he tested both of us. And Jim was positive, I was negative. And then all we did was turn around, pull back into the driveway, and this man came over, helped Jim out of the car, into the house, and got him settled. Now, what are the odds?
Yeah.
I know a mystical interlude when I have one.
I love it. It's I don't know. I've had so many in my life that you know, if you understand synchronicities and you keep your eye out for them, you see them all over the place, and they just happen more and more if you're open to them.
Well, I, I, I'm an advocate of that, Bob, because I believe that uh, a mystical interlude expands your reality. It puts you in a different realm of new thought, new life, new possibilities. And it teaches you, you can't help but start to realize that you are so much more. We are so conditioned to shut down anything that is not, can't be proven scientifically. I think that's changing these days, and it needs to, because these experiences are as real as the hand on your arm. They are real experiences,
Yeah.
and they do have an impact on who you are.
Well, audience, uh, as always, you've heard these words of wisdom. So take what resonates you and incorporate it into your life, and put the rest on a shelf until you're ready to deal with it. And until next time, this has been your spiritual journey.